finance study. You received the budget by email. You received it from the clerk. So does everybody okay with the budget? Okay, approved then. Minister, you have 10 minutes to make a statement. The floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you, committee, for inviting me to speak to you today.
I would also like to acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm accompanied by various representatives of Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as Natural Resources and Energy Canada. They will introduce themselves in the interest of time when they intervene. Carbon pricing works. This has never been clearer. It works at the business level and at the personal household level. It increases the success of all other emission reduction policies because it builds in a powerful incentive for energy efficiency right across the Canadian economy. ECCC's model, Environment and Climate Change Canada's modeling, showed that carbon pricing alone accounts for around a third of the emission reduction expected in Canada between 2005 and 2030. Other independent experts have calculated it to be even more effective in cutting Canada's carbon pollution. Let me summarize quickly how my department calculates these emissions reduction. EC Pro is a computable general equilibrium model that allows us to perform complex statistical calculations.
We start by showing a baseline that shows all provinces and territories, and it calculates the total emissions expected by 2030. Then there's a second hypothetical scenario that excludes carbon pricing. We also have excluded all but provincial provinces that have their own system. They are not covered by the federal backstop.
The difference is used to estimate the effect of carbon pricing on emissions. This results in a difference of 78 megatons of CO2 equivalent, which represents about a third of the total reduction that Canada plans to make between 2005 and 2030, according to our commitments under the Paris Agreement. By 2023, just the fourth year of implementation of our pricing system, our emissions would have been about 24 million tons higher without Canada's national minimum carbon price. The same effect as taking more than 7 million internal combustion passenger cars off the roads. This
is a measure that encourages the whole population, every household and every business to find ways to cut pollution whenever and however they want.
In provinces where the federal fuel charge applies, it represents a tiny fraction of inflation and the increase in the price of groceries, less than 0.5%. There's a 10% supplement for people living in rural and remote areas. And I would argue that if the Conservatives would stop delaying the adoption of the Fall Economic Statement, that would be increased to 20% for people living in rural areas. The government has also increased the rebate to Indigenous governments. And for provinces under the federal pricing system, with the Canada Carbon Rebate, 80% of Canadian households receive a refund greater than what they pay. In fact, if carbon pricing was abolished, not only would clean energy investment and job creation grind to a halt, our low and middle income families would have less money in their pockets.
In other countries, we see that have similar systems to us, there is stability to build a prosperous economy.
A price on carbon over 30 years ago has managed to cut its emission by a third and double the size of its economy. The same is true for us. British Columbia, which has had its own system for more than a decade, is experiencing rapid economic growth. We must also consider the demand for clean innovations, which is growing worldwide.
And because carbon pricing attracts investment in clean energy technologies and low carbon industry in Canada, it allows Canadian companies to take the lead.
If we abolished it, we would lose our position in the global race towards carbon neutrality.
And it would seriously harm Canadian companies exporting to other countries with carbon markets, which impose carbon adjustment mechanisms at their borders. So the European Union, for example, plans to do to implement such a system. So, and it's about $30 billion of Canadian exports to Europe that would be subject to these border taxes if we abolished the carbon tax here in Canada. And that's just the example of Europe. Other countries are looking at implementing such a system.
As a result of carbon pricing and other policies implemented since 2015, Canada is set to exceed, according to the Canadian Climate Change Institute, its 2026 interim climate objective of 20% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels. The most recent projections, published last December, suggest that Canada should achieve a 30% reduction by 2030. Also, the latest National Inventory Report confirms that emissions are consistent with our forecasts and they remain well below pre-pandemic levels. La production d'électricité et de chauffage.
Electricity and heat production in the public sector, has become less polluted, due in part to further reductions in coal consumption. Fugitive emissions from oil and gas extraction have also decreased.
The numbers are clear. Carbon pricing works. It will make it possible to achieve 1/3 of Canada's emission reduction by 2030. Every day, Canadians see the costly impacts of climate change, from droughts and wildfires to flooding and atmospheric rivers. Climate change costs Canadian households an average of $720 a year and are set to rise, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to $2,000 a year per household by 2050. Generational fairness means we can't saddle our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren with cleaning up our climate mess. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. I would like to inform the committee, and it's up to the committee to decide, but there are 9 minutes before the voting begins. So once the voting begins, I'm going to have to interrupt the session. So the committee will decide if it wants to resume once everybody has voted, or if they want an additional delay. So we'll see what happens. Mr. Mazur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Minister, how many megatons of emissions have been directly reduced from your carbon tax since it was introduced? Just a number.
I can give you the numbers. I have the table here. Just a second. Thank you, Chair. So you mean not by 2030, but so far?
Directly reduced from the carbon tax.
I know I have it here. Okay. Megatons, 2018, 5 megatons, 2019, 14 megatons, 2020, 17 megatons, 2021, 18 megatons, 2022, 19 megatons, and 2023, 24 megatons.
So I'm kind of confused, Minister, because out of an order paper question in January, you said the government does not measure the annual amount of emissions that are directly reduced by carbon tax.
I don't have that in front of me, but I believe the question was about tracking individual ministers' movement or in individuals in the country, which is not something we do.
It was not. It was directly, what was directly reduced by the carbon tax. So what numbers did you give us there just now?
I don't have that question or answer in front of me, but we published
You just
an annual national.
Give me some numbers. Where did those numbers come from?
National Inventory Report, which is published annually. It's something we submit to the United Nations. It's a public document.
So they're not the numbers directly from the carbon tax, emissions reduced from the carbon tax. They're numbers that are combined with a bunch of other stuff.
No, the numbers that I gave you are specifically related to carbon pricing. Maybe Associate Deputy Minister Lawrence Hanson would like to add something to that.
Thanks. I just partly just making sure you draw the distinction between National Inventory Report numbers, which talk about the amount of emissions in any given year, and versus the projections we do for future years on the basis of the model. And as the minister has indicated, there had been a previous question where we talked about how to attribute individual transportation as something for an emissions reduction, but we can, using our model, determine the extent to which emission projection reduction.
Excuse me, sir. Here I'm asking the minister. So those numbers you gave me, I guess you can forward them to us. they were from the carbon tax. They were the emissions directly reduced from the carbon tax. Yes or no?
The Supreme Court.
Yes or no?
The Supreme Court made it very clear that
Yes or
it's-
no? I'm asking
if
you a
if you're
direct
asking-
question.
And I'm trying to
Point of
answer-
order,
I'm
Mr. Chair.
Wait a minute.
Trying real hard to answer.
I'm
Mr.
curious about the answer as well. So we have to be careful that we don't all speak at the same time because it's not good for the interpreters. And the minister, no witness is obliged to answer yes or no. You can ask for a yes or no answer. But I think this is an important question, and I think it deserves a more complete answer. But so could you go ahead and answer that question? I think your question was, Mr. Mazur, the numbers that the minister cited, you want to know if they're attributable to the price on carbon. That's your question.
Directly, the emissions directly reduced by
Yeah,
carbon tax.
okay, so we'll let the minister address that, yeah.
Absolutely, Mr. President. So number one, the Supreme Court of Canada in its court case on carbon pricing was very
It's not
clear that
answering
the
the question.
system
I can
we
go-
put
I
in
have
place
another
is not a
question.
tax.
Point of
but
order,
the
Point of order.
answer
He's not
to your
answering the question,
question-
and I have another question.
I am. If you're
I have
allowed,
another
give me
question.
30
Okay.
seconds. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask
Give
for
him 30
30 seconds
Give it- Go.
to something as complex as carbon pricing. So the numbers that I quoted earlier are emission reduction from carbon pricing. We will be happy to communicate those to the committee.
Answer. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Mazur.
How many megatons of emissions were directly reduced from the carbon tax in 2023?
Well, we don't, the numbers for, John will correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have the numbers yet for 2023. We're still compiling those. It takes about 2 years, and that's the case for most nations to compile their inventory report. So the inventory report that was put out this year in 2024 was for 2022. The one we will put out next year will be for 2023. We anticipate that obviously could change, but we anticipate that it will be about 24 megatons next year. I mean, we'll have the report next year, but it'll be 2023 numbers.
Has your government decided whether or not it will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030? Yes or no?
The beginning of your question. I'm sorry.
Has your government decided whether they will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030? Yes or no?
There's been, as the chair of the committee said earlier, I'm not obliged to answer yes or no to those questions. There's been no such determination made at this point.
You're not obliged, but I think you have a moral duty to answer Canadians.
I have an obligation
But he
to
said
answer.
there's-
That's
there's-
exactly what I'm doing. I
there's been
think
no
those,
decision. There's been no
the-
decision.
an issue, and as significant to Canadians as climate change, deserve better than a yes and no answer. I guess that's my point.
Yes, they absolutely do. If you're going to go beyond quadrupling the carbon tax, absolutely. Any indication? Do you think you might?
And I'll remind you that it's not a carbon tax. It's a pricing system on carbon.
So the way it's going, do you think it might, or it might not?
I think it's the third time. I'm happy to repeat it again. It's your time, sir. We haven't had any conversations about that.
The Environment Commissioner revealed that your government gave away billions of dollars through their $8 billion net zero accelerator fund without knowing any of the emissions would be reduced. Were you aware of this?
I unfortunately don't have the Environment Commissioner's report in front of me. I was under the impression we were talking about carbon pricing, but I'd be happy to provide a response in writing to this question.
Talking about carbon pricing, talking about a model that was actually potentially going to reduce emissions. And you were having the government we were asking the government whether to prove it or not. So the net accelerator fund was actually from the commissioner's report, and I'll read it. The majority of the net zero accelerator contribution agreements do not have commitment for emissions reductions. Were you aware of that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this accelerator is under the responsibility of the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. I'm sure they would be happy to provide answer to your question. Again, it's not a question pertaining to carbon pricing.
Does that concern you at all? That the commissioner found this?
Again,
Does it at all?
Mr. Chair, I think
Any concern at all?
I gave an extra minute because of all the back and forth and interruptions. So, but we have to go now to Madame Châtel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Minister. to our committee. Our conservative colleagues are constantly talking about ending our carbon system, and I listen to them, but then I wonder, like, what do we do? What are the options? We talked a lot about in committee of alternatives, but my question for you is this. We have 300 economists who drafted a letter, an open letter, describing carbon pricing as one of the most effective and the least intrusive system to transition the economy via a green economy and to give us a chance to be a world leader in the new economy. Has your department looked at other alternatives, and are they as effective? How would that work if we eliminated our carbon pricing system? Thank you for the question. What I've always said is that if we can find another way at zero cost, without additional costs, to help us to reduce our emissions by at least a third by 2030, well, I'd love to see it. We haven't found one, and we looked at this with department officials. There are a number of other measures that we've implemented as well, more than 100 of them, but this is the one that's the most effective to help us to reduce our emissions. And at zero cost for the Canadian population. What comes in, goes out directly to families or small and medium businesses, municipalities and Indigenous organizations. So those, if those 300 economists said it, the parliamentary budget director said a few weeks ago as well that this is the least intrusive measure, as you said earlier, with regard to its impact on the economy. It's a measure that allows us to reduce emissions without having an impact on the Canadian economy. Thank you, Minister. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I would like to share it with my colleague, Ali.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, the witnesses, for being here. Through Chair, if we fail to take urgent action to address climate change, there will likely be places on our planet that will be almost impossible to live in. When we think of climate refugees, we often think about hotter countries, but Canada is actually warming at roughly 3 times the average mean warming rate. And last week, CBC reported that 43% of people displaced by wildfires globally in 2023 were actually being here in Canada. And unfortunately, we may be seeing this trend repeat this year. In total, displacement from floods, storms, wildfires, and other weather-related disasters rose to 31.8 million people last year, more than twice as many who were displaced by conflict and violence. What structure are being put in place nationally and internationally to monitor and respond to the anticipated national and global displacement of people? Minister, to you, please.
Thank you. It is very clear, and the science is very clear on that we've entered the era of climate change, and that we have both to play offense and defense. We have to play offense in the sense that we have to put in place everything we can to reduce as rapidly as we can our carbon pollution in Canada and around the world. But we also have to play defense because we've entered the era of climate change, and there are impacts felt across the world and certainly in Canada. You were talking about the forest fires. I was in British Columbia last week talking to members of the BC government who were telling me that the evacuation in Fort Nelson from 2 weekends ago is the earliest evacuation in the history of the province. We've never had that early in the year. We've seen other orders of evacuation across the country. So that's why we worked with all provinces and territories, Indigenous nations, municipalities, the private sector, insurance companies to develop the first ever national adaptation strategy to help better protect our communities, to help better protect Canadians, whether it's from wildfires, floodings, intensive heat waves that we're seeing more and more. But it's not just us who's looking into this. Canada is hosting the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal. So it's obviously an issue for I would argue for most Canadians and for most parliamentarians in the House of Commons. But it's an international issue, so much so that it's viewed now as a security issue. By the U.S. governments, by NATO, and many others. So far, we've invested about $10 billion as part of our as part of different measures to help Canadians be better ready to face the impacts of climate change and in disaster relief since 2015. We understand that we will need to do more. And for every dollar we invest in being better prepared, it's $15 we save.
We'll have to stop there because we have to vote, and then we'll come back to Mr. Trudel. So we'll take a little break to vote, and we'll resume after that.
I understand that Ms. Posé has become a grandmother for the second time. Yes. So please pass on our congratulations to her on behalf of the committee. I'd be pleased to do so. Thank you, Ms. Minister, for being there. Thank you for the officials for being here to answer these very important questions. And I'm very happy to be there to replace my colleague. In Longueuil, people are very concerned about climate change. In my riding in 2019, we had the highest score for the Green Party in Quebec, 12%. So it's a very important issue. Now, unfortunately, we're not heading in the right direction. Now, despite your efforts, Minister, and I'm looking at a La Presse article here in 2023, It says Canada has never reached its emissions goals, and the latest plan put in place by the Trudeau government is insufficient to meet our objectives. So that was La Presse. And then it's also difficult to not talk about climate change without also talking about investments in fossil fuels. So Le Devoir said, and I'm just looking for the article. So this is in August 20 something. So according to the FME, Canadian grants for fossil fuels reached $30 billion. So we're continuing to massively invest in fossil fuels. So in the emissions reductions plan, our goal is to get 30% reduction, and there are other industries that are called upon to reduce their emissions. We're asking these sectors less than we ask elsewhere. So there's a question about whether we can meet our objectives. And the gas and oil sector has only reduced its emissions by what we're asking is 31%. It's already lower than what we're asking from others, but they're only at 24%. It's been 10 years since the Paris Accord. And I think, so my question is this: would it not be time to seriously start considering lowering oil and gas production in Canada? Thank you for your question. Now, I said this earlier, but I'll repeat this. Again, according to the Canadian Climate Institute, an independent institute, we are on our way to achieving our 2026 objectives. And if we continue, and that's the if is very big there, we will be able to meet our objectives by 2020 or 2030. With regard to fossil fuels, we eliminated grants. We are the only G7 country that did it, and we did it 2 years earlier than our target year. So now, if you take a look at the reduction plan, you'll see that the targets vary from one industry to another. Well, sorry, the interpreter missed that question. Can we stop giving money? Did we stop giving money to the oil and gas sector? Well, the Pittsburgh Agreement, sorry. There's less noise now, but continue. All right, thank you, Mr. So the Pittsburgh Agreement was aimed at reducing ineffective measures. So grants that are only going to one industry and that would give them an advantage over other industries. So that doesn't include funding state corporations like BDC and so forth. What we committed to eliminating, there's no other G20 country that managed to do that. Now, why does the oil gas sector less targeted, or why are their targets lower? You know, we looked at each sector and we thought, okay, what are the possibilities for reducing emissions? And I invite you to look for the agricultural sector, for example, by 2030. We're asking that sector very little effort because implementing measures are going to take a great deal of time. So the efforts being asked of the oil and gas sector are much bigger than in the agricultural sector, for example. So why not require lower production? I think a sovereigntist party like yours will understand that the use of natural resources is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. So we can act as a federal government on pollution, methane, CO2, and that's exactly what we're doing by implementing clean fuel standards. That's the first time that we've had standards on those. Regulation on the methane reduction emissions. And we want to reduce that by at least 75%. Okay, yes. We have to, now your time is over. We have to go to Ms. Collins. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Minister for being here. First, I just wanted to ask about the numbers that you shared in response to Mr. Mazier's question. Were those numbers a combination of the industrial and the consumer carbon pricing system? Do you have those numbers, but each one, the industrial and the consumer side, separated out?
I don't know if we have them precisely disaggregated by year, but as the as we have reported and as various third parties have estimated, the industrial pricing system contributes about 2/3 of the total reduction.
Could we get those numbers if you, whatever you have?
Yes.
In 2022, the Environment Commissioner did a audit of Canada's carbon pricing system and found, and I'm going to quote here, that weak requirements for large emitter programs reduce the effectiveness of the carbon price. Then in March 2024, the Climate Institute released a report that you've mentioned already, and really seeing the huge potential in the output-based pricing system in the industrial carbon price. So I'm curious why your government continues to allow loopholes, to allow the biggest polluters to make billions off of this crisis and keep polluting.
So in reference to the 2022 Environment Commissioner's report, we in fact in 2022 renegotiated with all provinces and territories the federal benchmark to make it tighter than when it was introduced in 2019. Now, unfortunately, that was done it was finalized after the commissioner did his study, so he couldn't benefit from what we're doing. But we've already started tightening it, and as you know, the price continues increasing year after year.
And the loopholes in the carbon pricing system mean that big oil and gas companies pay a tiny fraction of the cost of their pollution, about 80 to 90%. Suncor pays 1/14 of the full carbon price. The federal backstop isn't actually doing the most effective job at reducing the emissions in the oil and gas sector. And we've seen that because the oil and gas sector has continued to increase their emissions. We've heard from the authors of the report from the Climate Institute that we could strengthen the industrial carbon price. Why aren't we?
We have, in fact, started another evaluation of the OPBS system to see where it could be further improved.
One of the things that you mentioned in your comments was that you were looking for zero costs to reduce emissions, that was the appeal of the carbon pricing system. Now, one way to get kind of net zero costs would be to put a windfall profits tax on oil and gas and to put that money into climate action, into things that would reduce our emissions. I'm curious why your government isn't implementing a windfall tax on oil and gas and funding some of the really critical pieces that would reduce our emissions dramatically.
Windfall profit tax wouldn't necessarily lead to emission reduction.
If you put the money into climate solutions.
We would have to model that and to look at what we do with the money, but in and of itself, the tax doesn't lead to emission reduction. My answer was specifically to what if we remove carbon pricing, and my answer is.
And my question is, why wouldn't your government consider a windfall tax? Actually, your government did consider a windfall tax, so it was reported in the Globe and Mail, but then lobbyists from the oil and gas sector convinced the government out of it. Multiple sources from the finance minister reported that you changed your mind after hearing from CAP and other oil patch lobbyists. Why not actually invest that money that, the UK, 20 other EU countries have done this. They have taxed the excess profits of oil and gas, and we have an opportunity to fund climate solutions that would dramatically reduce our emissions. Your government is saying that you're in a fiscal bind, that you can't tackle this crisis with at the scale and with the urgency that's needed. So why not implement a windfall tax and fund climate solutions?
A couple of things. We have invested on a per capita basis way more than the U.S. did through the inflation.
Could we focus on the windfall profits tax?
Well, were you talking about us saying we can't invest? I disagree with that. I profoundly disagree with that.
But could you answer the question about the windfall profits tax?
I will in a minute, in 30 seconds. We've invested $200 billion.
Mr. Chair, how many seconds do I have left?
You have 45 seconds.
Okay, so if you wait 30 seconds, I won't hear your answer. So I'm wondering if you can answer about a windfall profits tax.
If you let me answer, we've invested $200 billion to fight climate change and transition to a low-carbon economy. The Americans, about $370 billion. They're 10 times our size. So we're investing way more than the Americans does.
You have plenty of time to tout your government's policies, but why not consider a windfall profits tax on oil and gas? Tackle corporate greed, invest that money in climate solutions.
In your question, you talked about the reports about the Ministry of Finance. As you know, I'm the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I'm not the Minister of Finance.
Are you advocating for this to the Minister of Finance?
I haven't been lobbied by CAP or other fossil fuel companies on the not moving forward on the windfall profit tax.
Would you personally support?
We have to stop there and vote. Thank you.
Just to remind people that when there are a lot of people talking, it's very difficult to understand you in French because there's a big delay and it's impossible to follow the conversation. So please try not to interrupt too often. Mr. Deltel, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Minister. It's always nice to see you here in the committee. So we all agree that climate change is real and that we need to take action to reduce pollution. Now, we have a different vision than you do. In response to my colleagues' questions, you provided a number of figures. You talked about what figures related to carbon prices. And you were talking about the National Inventory Report, is that correct? Those figures? Yes, the data that I gave you are based on analyses. There's information that's in the National Inventory Report, and it's also based on the department's analyses. Are those done? Is that data projections, or is it real quantifiable data that we can attribute to carbon pricing? Well, as you know, we use modeling, so it's projections. It's projections for the future years. So when we say 78 million megatons by 2028, that's based on models. And these are models that being done by other. So you calibrated exactly the proportion and you of carbon pricing. It's a, well, it's not a tax, but yes, it's an analysis that's done by the department, that's done by other organizations to evaluating the impact of carbon pricing on emissions. Okay, well, I don't understand. You're here telling us that you are not able to quantify the exact impact of carbon pricing, but in this letter that you yourself signed, it's dated January 24th. It clearly says that the government does not measure the evaluation of the reduction of emissions that are directly related to carbon pricing, the federal carbon pricing system. So what is true? Is what you're telling me true, or is it what this letter tells me? Is that what's true? Well, as I said, the National Inventory Report is a public document that's published every year as part of our obligations under Now, the response that you're referring to dealt with a question, and I don't have it in front of me, but it was talking about measuring the impact of carbon pricing on individual travel.
Are directly reduced from federal carbon pricing. Il n'y a pas question de déplacement, là.
There's no mention of travel here. Well, you're commenting on a document that I don't have before me. I have lots of information here to share with you. I don't know it all by heart, but so I have to refer to those documents or to the colleagues from the department and other departments that are from time to time. But what I can tell you is that I provided you with figures today, dated May 21st, that give an explanation that's based on the inventory and on an analysis conducted by our department of the impact of carbon pricing on our emissions targets. Well, it contradicts what you wrote yourself in January. So, I mean, you can present a list of figures, but you're able to provide them now. You weren't able to provide them before. Well, I provided you 5 of them from 2018 to 2022, and we did projections as well for 2023 to 2030. I have, listen, we're both Quebecers. We know that Quebec has a different system, and you know, as I do, that you have the power to impose carbon pricing in Quebec. Are you going to do it? If so, when and how much? We have an agreement with the Quebec government. The Quebec system continues to apply as other provinces have done. Okay, so it's equivalent, but your aim is to quadruple the pricing on carbon. So if ever there was no longer equivalency between the two systems, when are you going to be imposing your rates in Quebec, and by how much? I have no intentions of imposing rates on Quebec. Now, Quebec system is not based on price, it's based on emissions reductions. It's a carbon-based system, yes, but that's a cap and change or cap and exchange program. And the price in Quebec is very different than it is elsewhere. And people that are just comparing the prices, they miss a lot of the complexity of the system. Ms. Taylor-Roy, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister Guilbeault, for being here today to answer our questions on the price on pollution. You know, the last 2 weeks have shown that climate change has a real cost, and no responsible government or political party should ignore that. You know, we're only in May, and yet there's been thousands of Canadians displaced from their homes, and the air quality has been affected. We know that impacts health costs. There's the cost of the damage, and there's the cost to our economy. The Canadian Climate Institute estimated through their reports on the cost of climate that it could slow economic growth by about 50%, costing $25 billion by 2025. And there are costs that aren't even estimated there. So I'm wondering, instead of outright denying climate change recently, the Conservatives have changed tacks and they're trying to undermine the carbon pricing system, even going as far as to question the modeling, which has now been provided and fully, and I'm not quite sure what we're going to hear back on that. And we know that hundreds of scientists have endorsed not only carbon pricing, but also the model. So it's clear that the only scenario where opposing climate action makes sense is if you don't believe that climate change will have real costs. But the evidence is staring us in the face. So could you share with the committee the consequences of not taking action to address climate change by putting a price on pollution?
As I said earlier, we've entered the era of climate change, and most of us, not all of us in this room, but most of us believe that climate change is a very important issue and one that's deserving of all our attention and all of our efforts. And we've adopted in the last few years unprecedented rate of measures, and we've adopted investments that we've never seen in the history of this country to tackle this very issue. In fact, Canada just received an award from the Climate Scorecard, rating us, giving us a score of 70% for what we've been doing on climate change. So it's not, we're not perfect, and some are ahead of us, but we've certainly come a long way from where we used to be pre-2015. You've spoken about the cost of climate change. We've seen the insured cost of climate change go from an average of $400 million per year in Canada to about $2 billion. The last 2 years were about 50% higher than this $2 billion a year of insured cost to Canadians. If I may use a bit of a parallel, a very incredible Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, when faced with a similar challenge, ozone depletion, decided to tackle this head on. Imagine if in 1987, Brian Mulroney would have said, oh, we don't believe in ozone depletion. We're not sure it's caused by human. We don't really believe in the modeling. It's going to be too expensive to do anything about it. Well, MP Bazan from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman spoke about skin cancer today before question period and how, what we need to do. If we hadn't tackled ozone depletion, skin cancer in Canada would be through the roof. The cost of the Canadian health system, the incredible cost to Canadians. I would hope that the Conservative Party of Canada could use the same wisdom and foresight in dealing with climate change and say, you know what, this is a really big issue, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to work together to tackle this issue, as they did as a party in 1987 when it came to fighting ozone depletion. And no one talks about ozone depletion. You ask kids who are 20, 25, they've never heard about ozone depletion. Why? Because it's largely being solved. And the ozone layer is doing better, and it should have recovered by 2060. Imagine if the Conservative Party of Canada did that for climate change, where we would be as a country. One can only hope, and one can only dream, I guess.
Thank you very much, Minister. Oh, I do. Great. Okay. Well, then I will continue with my next question, which was really to ask, in particular, when you're looking at the cost of climate change, there's a lot of talk about not being able to estimate accurately what's going to happen. And so we don't always see that balance. We know what it's going to cost. We can look at the price on pollution, but we aren't always able to estimate what it will cost us if we don't take action. How do you address that, and how does the department try and encompass those costs that can't be completely refined or defined?
I'm sorry, but we're really out of time, and I'm going to break now so that we can vote.
Mr. Chair, well, to continue off on where I left off, the elephant in the room in Canada is oil and gas production. It's the grants that we give to the sector. Now, I knew you before your political career. I knew that you were committed to the cause, and you're in the wrong country. We're in a country that this is a country that continues to produce oil and gas. So oil and gas rose to 31% even before the opening of the Trans Mountain. That was a $4 billion project. We could have used that money in something else, and we're not even talking about Baie du Nord. Baie du Nord, we're talking about 116 million tons of emissions, and you approved that project. So, we can play around with measures, but the elephant in the room is the oil and gas sector. We were talking about indirect and indirect. The 5 biggest oil and gas companies, $225 billion. We shouldn't be giving a cent to those people. So my question is simple. In a country, how that we continue to increase our production, how can we hope to decrease our emissions? That's my question. Thank you. Well, we already are reducing emissions. They fell by 7%, and that makes us among the G7 leaders in reduction over that period. But I'm the first to say to recognize that there's a lot of work to do in the oil and gas sector. That's why we implemented a clean fuels standard, methane regulations, clean electricity regulations. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to try to answer your first question before I go into your second question. But so the cap on gas emissions will make so that regardless of what happens in the oil and gas sector, our emissions will go down over time. So that cap, we're working to put it in place with our colleagues from the department and other departments, and to make sure that oil and gas sector does its fair part in terms of reducing emissions. Like all other sectors of the Canadian economy. If we look at methane emissions, for example, they've started going down in the oil and gas sector. So,
thank you, Mr. Chair. And how many minutes do I have?
2.5.
Thank you. So we were talking about the windfall profits tax, and the PBO has said that if we implemented a 15% windfall profits tax, we would generate $4.2 billion for the government over 5 years. The UK has implemented a 30% windfall profits tax on oil and gas. Can you answer, are you in support of this idea? Are you looking at it? Are you advocating internally for a windfall profits tax so that we could tax corporate greed and put that money into climate solutions?
So as I said earlier, I'm not the finance minister. This is a question you should ask of the finance minister. I am, as I said to our colleague in French just a minute ago, I am in favor of putting in place measures to ensure that the oil and gas sector does its fair share when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in this country.
So one of those policies is the emissions cap. Now, we know that there are so many loopholes in that proposed policy that the oil and gas sector is going to be not doing their fair share when it comes to reducing emissions, allowing for offsets. Do you think that delaying this as long as you have, and then allowing oil and gas to really reduce their emissions less than other sectors of the economy, don't you think that's actually putting the burden on everyday Canadians and other sectors to do the bulk of emissions reductions?
I respectfully disagree with your characterization of what we're doing on the oil and gas cap, as well as other measures. Offsets are an internationally agreed upon mechanism of the Paris Agreement.
And the target is 40% by 2030. But
40 to 45 is what you take.
Yeah, the low end is 40%, and yet the oil and gas sector will only have to do about half of that with your emissions cap.
That's not correct. We're aiming to get the oil and gas sector, as per the emission reduction plan, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 31%.
But with offsets, they could reduce it as little as 20%. Is that not correct?
It will be, we're still working on presenting the draft regulations in the coming months, so I
But the
can't give you a
proposed
I can-
ones outline offsets up to about 20%.
That's not the case. We haven't proposed anything yet since the draft regulations aren't out yet. They will be in the coming months, but they're not out yet.
That, the end of that segment, Ms. Collins. Mr. Leslie, I believe you're going to be splitting with Mr. Cram. Is that correct?
How long?
Pardon?
6 minutes or
5.
5 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. I just want to go back to some of those numbers you gave earlier and trying to understand how accurate some of the numbers that are in theory firm in the National Inventory Report that we're submitting to with our international colleagues. But it is all based on a projection. Is that correct? That when we say we are going to reduce 30% of emission reductions by 2030 will be done via the carbon tax, that is a projection. Not even in the years past that it's been in place, we don't actually currently know how much that has reduced emissions. Is that correct?
That's not correct.
How do you attribute the information then? How do you know with certainty that what percentage of the NIR reporting that you are offering is due to a carbon tax?
So I think there's two things here. The National Inventory Report is an annual exercise where we measure the emission reduction from different sectors of the economy, different provinces, and that's measurement. That there is some there's some modeling, but largely it's based on hard data. We do have to, for example, fugitive emission in the oil and gas sector is harder to measure because they are fugitive emissions by definition. We started using aerial measurement to complement some of the work we've been doing on the inventory. That's one thing. What the answer to your question on what is the role of carbon pricing is not related to the National Inventory Report. It's based on analysis looking at different measures and how much they contribute to emission reduction in Canada.
So I appreciate that. That's the reason that we're here today. We invited you to the committee to discuss exactly that. You've seen, obviously, the 3 motions that this committee has passed with varying degrees of simplicity in terms of just looking for the variables, the assumptions, and the data included to specific language regarding EC Pro. If you were a member of this committee, not the minister sitting there, would you feel confident and comfortable with the responses your department has given this committee in terms of the production records that we are asking for? Because when I see a document that is a website link, when I see a document that is written by 4 people that don't even work for ECCC and it says draft on it and it says this is not representative of ECCC or the Government of Canada, and then thirdly a 3-pager with an attachment of a so-called independent think tank which turns out is funded by ECCC, do you think that is sufficient? Honestly, do you think that's sufficient in terms of what we are looking for? Because I think all of these questions could be answered if you would just hand over the modeling as requested by this committee so that we could better understand how you are coming to these conclusions. Is that not a reasonable request, Minister?
So I'm quite clearly not a climate modeler, although I have in my life worked on a number of occasions with climate modelers. It's a very complex exercise. It's not magic. It's mathematics, and we use modeling in all sectors of our society. We use it in economy, we use it in health, we use it in employment sectors, and we use it in the climate change sector as well. We have provided information, and you have our chief, I don't know if it's your title, Derek, but let's call him for the sake of argument, our chief modeler with you here today so he can answer your question. This is it is, I'll be the first one to recognize that it is complex. And you want simple answers. I'm sorry. There's no simple answer when it comes to climate change or modeling.
I appreciate that, Minister. And listen, I'm not a climate modeler either. I'm not saying that I'm going to be the one that is going to understand as I believe it was 280,000 formulas and data points that would be included in the model. My point is that people in this country can outside of ECCC. So my 2-part question, I guess. Why are you so hesitant to just hand over that data? If you won't hand it over to us, who else has seen or used EC Pro? I noticed in the 3rd response it said Navius Consulting used CGE models, but I'm curious, has the data inputs that your modeling is using in CG Pro, or GC Pro, has it been peer reviewed by anybody else? You've talked about 300 economists talking about how great the carbon tax is. Have they looked at this analysis? Who has seen this outside of ECCC? And why are you so unwilling to give it over to this committee and let Canadians have a look at the data that you're using to make the assumptions that you are that the carbon tax is actually working?
So the way the modeling community tends to work is that obviously there are different models out there. Let's talk specifically about climate change. There are different models out there. And what the modeling community is trying to do is to work together to ensure that despite the fact that we are using different models, there's not 15 of them out there, but there's some of them, that we understand what are the underlying elements of each of those models, so that when different people use different models, we at least can agree in what goes into the models. Which
why
will
can't
have,
it be open though? Why
well,
would you
in
want
fact,
everybody to see
We're out of time, unfortunately.
Shouldn't it be fair for everybody that can understand this stuff to be able to see it?
We're out of time. And so Mr. Cram didn't get a question. Sorry about that, Mr. Cram. That was out of my control. We'll go now to Mr. Longfield. But, you know, the officials are with us for another hour. So these are questions that can be asked to Mr. Hernan. Is it Hernandez? Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here. I'm thinking of the project-based modeling, modeling that could have been used by the Environment Commissioner. I don't think he did use it. For some of the investments in clean technology that are happening as a result of the pricing formulas that we've put out into the market, we've sent a signal that carbon pricing is going to be a long-term solution that we're using to drive down the emissions and create a strong market signal to attract investments. When I look at the technology, the clean technology investments that Rio Tinto is doing, ArcelorMittal, Alcoa, investing in production of green steel, green aluminum, creating thousands of good-paying jobs and reducing emissions, the reductions that we're going to see from that haven't been included, as far as I know, in the Environment Commissioner's report that we saw a few weeks ago. Could you comment on the importance of attracting clean technology investments and what that means to decarbonization in Canada?
Thank you very much, Mr. Longfield. This is actually a really interesting question, and one thing that doesn't get talked enough, in my humble opinion, enough, and it seems that on that I agree with the new head of Alberta Oil Sands Group, which in the CBC article, I quote, wants clarity from Poilievre, that's the title of the article, on industrial carbon pricing. I'll just read you the first paragraph of that article. Conservative Party Pierre Poilievre needs to clarify where he stands on industrial carbon pricing, says the new head of a major oil sands group that aims to bring the industry's emission to net zero, largely through the potential of construction of massive carbon capture project that relies on carbon credits that are derived from carbon pricing. In fact, we can point to a number of projects that have taken very large projects that have taken place in Canada. And according to the companies themselves, you don't have to take my word for it, the $11.5 billion investment by Dow Chemical in Fort Saskatchewan, part of the funding is based on carbon pricing. Pattern Energy, $4 billion in Newfoundland. Dofasco Steel, kind of closer to your neck of the woods, $1.8 billion in Hamilton. SMR Development in Saskatchewan, $74 million. All of these projects are partly being funded through carbon pricing. If we get rid of this, then it is estimated that anywhere between the taxpayers would be on the hook, if we wanted to fund those projects directly, on the hook for $20 to $48 billion. Now, the Conservatives say that they're in favor of technology. These are all technological projects that are taking place in different sectors: steel, SMR, energy savings, chemical sector. So are they telling us that their technical strategy is to put Canadian taxpayers on the hook for an extra $20 to $48 billion, or we can do that at no extra fee to Canadians by using carbon pricing?
Thank you, Minister. In terms of dollars and cents, it makes sense to do what we're doing. But in terms of timing, some of these projects won't be coming on until 2028. So they're not showing up in the current figures coming from Environment Climate or from the Environment Commissioner. When these projects come on, they're also phased over some years. Are we going to be including those in our models going forward, or are we already including them in some of the projections that you're giving us?
I'll turn to Derek, our expert on modeling for that.
Yeah, so we have, I think the minister explained it, there's historical data, and that's in the National Inventory Report that's published with a 2-year lag. And then we have projections that go forward out to the future.
In terms of projects that are coming down the road, say in 2027, when would they get, or 28?
One more question.
Oh, when do we include them in the modeling?
Well, we do, when we have a program that's funding projects, we put a proxy into the model to try and estimate how many megatons might come from the overall spending program. And then once we get details of the specific projects, like 2 steel projects, we can then build that exact detail into the model.
Also in Ontario, we have the rural top-up. We're just passing legislation this afternoon on the report stage of the fall economic statement. The rural top-up is an important signal and support for the rural communities.
Yes, and I would urge the Conservative members of this committee maybe to talk to the rest of their party to support doubling the rural top-up for Canadians. We think it would be a very meaningful measure to help support millions of Canadians across the country.
We're done for this round. We thank you for being here, Minister. We're going to continue with the departmental representatives. I think we're seeing you again next Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, on the 28th. Is that correct? So we look forward to seeing you again. We really appreciate all the time that you spend with us at committee. It's all very interesting. And so thanks again for today. And we will continue now. We're starting a second panel, so we'll do a 6-minute round and then a 5-minute round. And we begin the 6-minute round with Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. I listened quite attentively to some of the numbers that were being cited in the first hour of this meeting, and I just want to make sure I have the math correct. So in 2022, we had emissions were at 708 megatons, and the carbon tax was responsible for reducing 19 megatons in 2022. So by my math, that works out to a 3% reduction. So am I to understand that the debate about the carbon tax and the need to keep the carbon tax in place on Canadians and the rise in the cost of living caused by the carbon tax, that is only for 3% of our total reductions? Is that correct?
Thank you. I'll maybe perhaps start, and then I'll maybe turn to Derek to add some additional information. So it's the distinction between how much of the carbon price might have affected emissions in 1 year versus how much in 2030. And so when you've heard us talking about 1/3 responsible for 1/3 of reductions, we are talking about the 2030 number. And so by 2030, our modeling suggests that the carbon price will have resulted in 78 megatons of reductions. And then Derek, maybe you could talk to the year-over-year issue. Yeah, so we did do the estimate for individual years. The number you're referring to, the 708, that's not emissions reductions. That's like total emissions in the country. So when we talk about 1/3, it's 1/3 of our expected reductions. So then that, like Lawrence said, that's getting to 2030 when the carbon price is at its $170 level.
Can I, sorry, don't want to prolong this too long, but can I just clarify some of the numbers that you put out? You refer to 1/3 and 3%. 3% is the reduction in total emissions, right? 1/3 of those reductions are attributable to carbon pricing, right? So it's not that carbon pricing has only achieved 3% of reductions. Carbon pricing has contributed to 1/3 of total reductions.
Yes, but 3% of the total emissions have been reduced as a result of carbon pricing. Am I to understand that correctly?
No, 3%. No, emissions have declined 3% in total.
Oh, okay, and so only 1% of those 3% are from the carbon tax. Is that correct?
To date?
Yes. Okay. So are we getting good value for our money, I guess I should say. Like my party has talked a great deal about the need to invest in new technologies instead of just raising the carbon tax higher and higher and higher. If our total emissions have only been reduced by 1% as a result of the carbon tax, I can't help but think, aren't there other technological innovations out there that could be achieved at much less cost to consumers to reduce total emissions by that 1%?
Thank you for the question. So I think, I think that would make the assumption that somehow the carbon price is a form of spending that could be redirected elsewhere. Where, I mean, in operation, the carbon price is something that is charged and then largely revenue neutral, where the funding is actually returned in various different ways, sending a price signal. But it's not as if the carbon price is in a sense using spending that could be directed elsewhere for technologies and so forth.
Okay, so this committee has asked several times for the models that the department is using for its emissions calculations, and we've been redirected to a page on the department's website. We've gotten reports describing some of the formulas, but to date we have not received the entire model. And I was thinking the other day, if you go to the Elections Canada website, you can enter your postal code and look up which riding you're in and where you go vote on election day. If you go to the Canada Post website, you can track where your parcel is if it's being delivered. Why can't Environment and Climate Change Canada post on its website the complete carbon tax model that it has been using, so that Canadians and members of Parliament and everyone can see how far along we are in terms of reducing our emissions and how much that is attributable to the carbon tax?
Thanks for the question. Again, I'll start and then turn to Derek to provide additional detail. But it's probably worth starting with saying what we actually have provided so far, and maybe try to clarify a few things that came up in the earlier rounds of questioning. So what we've done so far has been to provide all the assumptions that drive the two reference cases, the one reference case with the existing measures and one with the additional measures. And we've given a complete list of all the federal activities and provincial activities that lead to those two different reference cases, which you'll recall from the OPQ or REF22 and REF22A. And so we provided that and the numbers associated with that. To be honest with you, the model itself, the model is actually, it's the code, it's the software language, it's a data set, and as I think we noted, it's 280,000 variables. It wouldn't really be a matter of posting a model on a website.